Welcome to Wandering Jews at J Squared Adventures. Travel far enough and you meet yourself.
We're your hosts. I'm Scott.
I'm Sorrel.
So I'd be really happy if people disagree with me, but I would like to suggest that everyone, each one of us, and actually every culture, every community, dreams of a golden age. Now, Bruce Springsteen, who not only is, in my mind, the poet laureate of modern America and one of my most important teachers, he calls that dream glory days. The nostalgia for a past that may have been, but actually maybe didn't exist, but's recalled in the light of a present that, you know what, sometimes the present doesn't necessarily fulfill all the promises and hopes. Golden ages, glory days, looking back on something to boost us up, pick us up, push us forward. If we widen the lens and we look at our own times, I was struck by an article that was written recently in The Atlantic. Franklin Foer penned an article called The End of the Golden Age. Foer is looking at American Jewry in the wake of the Hamas invasion and the massacre of October 7th and marking the startling new centrality of anti-Semitism on the left and on the right in the United States, and he asks whether the best of times for American Jews is behind us, and he suggests that a new darkness is on the rise. Now, no doubt, again, in my mind, that the search for a golden age is about the search for hope, about the belief that in times of trouble, remembering a past that shines a beacon to light our present, it provides a special strength. And when we travel, when we do Jewish travel to Spain and Portugal, Iberia, the peninsula perched on the edge of Africa and the rim of Europe, it holds out the opportunity to recall a different golden age, a period roughly between the 10th and the 12th centuries, to be more specific, bookended from about 711 CE, what we generally call AD, and 1492 CE. 711, the beginnings of Muslim rule in Iberia until 1492, the Catholic reconquest and subsequent expulsion of Muslims and Jews from Spain and later Portugal.
I think the question really is, like most things, how golden was the golden age of the Iberian Jewry? And like everything in life, it boils down to a matter of perspective, right? We're looking at the golden age of Spain. So when we're looking at Jewish life in Spain and Portugal under Muslim rule in much of the Middle Ages, and if we compare that to Jewish life in much of Europe in that time period in the Middle Ages, you can say that Jewish life existed under an umbrella of relative tolerance, unlike anything that existed for the Jewish people under Christendom, right? Because if we think about under Christendom, Jews were subject to wild accusations, forced segregation, mob violence. Now, it's not that the Jews of Iberia's golden age necessarily enjoyed such liberty, but the setting was there for them to flourish nonetheless. If we look back, it's one of Jewish history's most creative periods of relative openness. So we're looking at, perhaps you could even say that it was golden despite, but remembering very, very much that there is this idea of relativity. It's like, if I were to think about it, it's like, in parentheses, relatively golden.
For sure. The issue of comparison is an important one, and comparing what was happening in Spain and Portugal under Islam as compared to what was happening largely in Christian Europe was very different. I think there's something else here. And again, moving forward, even after the expulsion from Spain in 1492, the amazing creativity and contribution that Sephardic Jewry, right? Sfarad, the Hebrew name that's usually used to refer to the communities of Spain and Portugal, and Sephardi, the Jews whose homes were not in Christian Europe, who did not speak Yiddish, but they came from a different branch of the Jewish tree, a branch that was so rich, gave such beautiful fruit. And when we look what happened after the expulsion from Spain, 15th, 16th century, these were communities that they reestablished themselves across North Africa, in the Netherlands, in South and Central and North America. The first Jewish communities to make a place for themselves in Dutch New Amsterdam, of course what became New York, they were Sephardic Jews. They were the descendants of the exiles of 1492.
They were even able to create, in the aftermath, develop that language of Ladino, which emerged as a Jewish language based on 15th century Spanish and Hebrew that, took in a medley words from Arabic, Turkish, Greek, and French. And hundreds of thousands of Jews used Ladino as a language following the exile, following the Inquisition. And you can see this parallel that Yiddish, emerged as the main language of Ashkenazi, right? European Jews under Christendom. Ladino was the linguistic home for Sephardic Jewry. And, this relative, again, going back to the idea of relative tolerance enjoyed by the Jews under Islam. So what was harvested, what was born during that period? It was a cultural flourishing in Jewish and general philosophy, poetry, music, communal life, and some of the greatest figures in the Jewish experience were Sephardic Jews living during the Golden Age. And Scott, it's hard to think of, let's say, if we're talking about American history. If I had to put you on the spot, who would you say the three great superheroes are in your minds of American history?
The image of the superhero is a good one in some ways because it's very much alive in our popular imagination today, and it does raise a kind of a smile. And if we're talking about, all right, not necessarily, Batman and Spider-Man and, Thor or the Hulk. Sorry that I'm mixing DC and Marvel together. Purists will forgive me. But if we're talking about American history, there are certain characters who would say, wow, they rise above all the rest. It could be George Washington, and it could be Abraham Lincoln.
Good one.
And it could be Rosa Parks. And these are people who their lives became something emblematic about what does it mean to be an American. And in that sense, I think the superheroes of the Golden Age, they're Sephardic Jews who rose to such a level and whose influence was so wide that we remember them today because they became emblematic of the Jewish experience as a whole.
So when we're looking at the periods of Sephardic Jewries, and if we were to transplant that idea of three superheroes, the ones that come to mind are Shmuel HaNagid, Moses de Leon, and Rambam, Maimonides.
Yeah, three amazing examples. And for sure, Shmuel HaNagid, what a superhero.
Talking of superheroes.
Yeah, you're talking about someone who obviously was a Jewish communal leader. He was an interpreter of Jewish texts. He was someone who was known in the Jewish world. But not only that, again, there was an openness here to the general society. And it seems that he started his career writing letters for the royal court, the Berber court of the city of Granada, which was sometimes known as Granada of the Jews because of the prominence of Jews in the court and in the city and in the economic and the intellectual life of the town. And Shmuel HaNagid rose through the ranks from these fairly humble beginnings. Again, a letter writer for the royal court. He was someone who, again, he had an acumen. He had a charisma. He was someone who had a great integrity to the extent that not only did he become essentially the prime minister, the high vizier of the royal court, but he became what we would call today the chief of staff of its army, a Muslim army led by a Jewish general. Now, again, we tend to say Jewish generals, Bar Kokhba, 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And then we jump to, the American Colonel Mickey Marcus, who came to the early state of Israel and fought Yigal Yadin, Moshe Dayan.
Right.
Here's an example of a Jewish military figure who for 20 years led the Muslim armies of Granada into battle to great success. And in that sense, really a superhero, combining so many different types of areas of creativity and activity
he was a
and
poet.
work.
He's got his military prowess, but, he was the first major poet in the Hebrew literary Renaissance, which, I don't know that people necessarily associate him with his poems about Jewish life and longings, and his aspirations, also included wine, love, romance. And in a way, I think you can say that his background as a military commander, you can feel it, inspired him in his poetry about what it means to live the life of a warrior and the price of battle. Because we're talking about the Golden Age, but it would be misplaced to think that there was no sense of persecution or unrest at the time. He had to flee political unrest in his native Cordoba. And in one poem, when he's reflecting on his secular ambitions, and I'm going to quote this because I love it so much. In the translation, should someone unguilty hold back from longing towards heights like the moon? Should he wait, weaving its light across him, like a man stretching taut his tent skin? And, in plain prose, these lines are even stronger than in the translation. Can a man know restraint when his soul is pure and strives to rise like the moon? Can he know rest until he ties the moon's hem to his waist as one ties on cloth for a garment? So we can see his poetry as a vehicle also of his ambition and that sense of looking towards, that sense of aspiration, of being in your current situation. And that also was the fertile ground for the Golden Age, right? That sense of creativity, even in times of unrest.
Definitely. And that, again, that sense that you quote in the poem of ambition, of striving. We use the phrase reaching for the moon. Here's Shmuel HaNagid using that same phrase so many hundreds of years ago. It's really a tribute to the way that literature, poetry, great writing, and great figures, they live beyond the historical moment. And if people want to check out the Anthology of Hebrew Verse, T. Carmi put together quite a few years ago. But if you look at the poems of people like Shmuel HaNagid, like even Gibby Roll, like Yehuda Levi, which are all contained in this volume, you can see a richness of writing, which some of these poems, war, love, drinking, things, some of them which are very everyday, and things pedestrian, and things that also we still live with today, ambition, loss. Universal themes. And in that sense, it's worth going back to and checking it out, for sure. Another figure who I would add to the list is Moshe de Leon. Now, he's a bit later. We're talking like 1250 to about 1305. But he's an interesting figure because here we're talking about the Jewish mystical tradition, which, again, like all things, Judaism is a weaving of a tapestry, exactly, that goes back in time, and it's only continues when we choose to add to it. Biblical times, we have mysticism, like Elijah's ascension to heaven in the chariot, like Ezekiel's vision of the fiery wheel, the heavenly throne. But one of the key documents, the foundations of the Jewish mystical tradition, is the set of books known as the Zohar. And in traditional Judaism, it's held that this was a book that was written by Shimon Bar Yochai, a late Second Temple figure, an outstanding rabbi who lived during the period of the Bar Kokhba revolt. Modern scholars, really since the beginning of the 20th century, particularly Gershom Sholem and then later others, attribute the authorship of the Zohar to Moses de Leon.
Even though Moses de Leon attributed it to
That's
Shimon
right.
Bar Yochai.
And it seems like that, one, we know that both from Jewish and from non-Jewish writing, there was a kind of a tradition of, to use a fancy phrase, pseudo-epigrapha. The idea that an author, in order to give weight to his writing, will attribute it to an earlier figure who is considered of more standing. And Moshe de Leon did this with a few different works that he wrote. Like, for example, he wrote a book called Orchot Chaim, Ways of Life.
Right.
And he attributed that to another Talmudic sage, Rabbi Eliezer. And so, again, the question of whether Shimon Bar Yochai wrote the Zohar or whether Moshe de Leon wrote it or whether Moshe de Leon edited it
the mystery
and built it,
surrounding
I'm going to leave that. That's a whole debate in of itself.
Yeah.
But definitely Moshe de Leon played a very, very central part here in compiling, writing, putting together the editions of the Zohar that we know today. And this book, again, the tradition grew. Without his work, there wouldn't have been the mystics of Tzfat. Because the mystics of Tzfat, the Ari HaKadosh, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, he based himself, obviously among other things, on the Zohar. Later on, a movement like Hasidism, this popular uprising of Jewish mysticism as a source for renewing the Jewish masses in Eastern Europe, was largely based on the book produced by a Sephardic rabbi, philosopher, and mystic in the middle of the Golden Age of Spain, named Moshe de Leon. And so the chain of tradition, I hate that phrase. I prefer the tree of tradition.
I like that.
It continues to grow. And Moshe de Leon, also another important Golden Age of Spain Jewish superhero whose work became an important basis for the continuation of that tree.
Beautiful. And of course, we have Maimonides, right? And he was compared with the biblical Moses. He's known as the great eagle, phenomenal, accomplished physician, rabbi, legal scholar, philosopher. Even in the non-Jewish world, he's known as one of the outstanding figures of the Golden Age as a true Renaissance man. So his personal story was that he was born and educated in Cordoba, and he and his family fled to Egypt, right, and settled in Cairo. He actually became a personal physician to one of the most outstanding Muslim rulers of that time, Salah ad-Din, whose armies defeated the Christian Crusaders at the Horns of Chittim, not far from Tiberias and Safat, in July 4th of 1187.
He was really, in that sense, a true Renaissance man. In many ways, comparable with the figure of Shmuel HaNagid.
His diet is used today, the Maimonides diet.
Right.
People look to Maimonides for nutritional advice. There are all kinds of groups surrounding going for his diet.
Yeah, 1,000 years later, basically. And when, again, you talk about his role in Jewish life and in philosophical life, I mean, you're talking about philosophical classics. Obviously his book, The Mishnah Torah. In another episode, we talked about the Mishnah and the compiling of the Mishnah by the Sanhedrin and Yudah Nasi and Sipori. And Maimonides is part of that tradition of building on that. Nice. And his Mishnah Torah is an attempt to continue the tradition of interpretation and renewal and cultivating the tree of tradition.
And the Guide for the Perplexed.
The Guide, incredible, because we're talking about here a book that was using the contemporary Arab philosophy, Islamic philosophy of its time. It was relying on Greek classical philosophy, which in Christian Europe was basically unknown. He writes about, in the Guide, astronomy. He writes about medicine, obviously. And so the Guide becomes not just a central text for the Jews, but it becomes really one of the outstanding classics of philosophy in the Western tradition. And although in Hebrew we tend to refer to Maimonides as the Rambam, right? Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, the idea of his Greek source name, Maimonides, is only one of the, in this case, small tributes to his great acumen and his great scholarship. And again, his ability to write a series of volumes that lived long after.
We think back to these three Jewish superheroes of the Golden Age. I think what we can safely say is that there may be a question mark in how golden the age was, but these superheroes were golden. The products of this time, whose legacy is enduring and whose creativity we are, nourished with until today, that is ongoing. That is golden.
Yeah, the phrase you're using of nourishing I like a lot, and it's, I think, connected with the image of the tree. Again, the Sephardic community that grew out of and was inspired by people like the folks we just mentioned was an incredible source of life for the Jewish people, and really in many ways was the nobility of the Jewish people all throughout the period after the Golden Age of Spain. Demographically, as Eastern European Jewry became much larger in terms of the basic numbers, Sephardic Jewry became much smaller. But again, let's not be confused. The numerical fact of Sephardic Jewry as a minority in the Jewish world following the Golden Age of Spain and the exile does not mean that the Sephardic community did not continue in the arts, in music, in liturgy, in literature, in commerce. We're talking about a community that from Saloniki to Constantinople, what today obviously is Istanbul, all across North Africa, and as I mentioned, even in the Americas, or what became the Americas, I should say, was very central, both in terms of the continuation of the Jewish story, but also in terms of their contribution to general culture.
We're talking about our journeys, right? So if you're in Jerusalem, let's say, you're in the streets of Rehavia, you'll notice street names that mark some of the great figures that we've spoken about, Sephardic Jewry, the Golden Age. Actually, a statue of Moshe de Leon can be seen in his hometown in Spain. And likewise, Cordoba, right, where Maimonides was from, pays tribute to him with a statue in his honor. And Shmuel HaNagid, there is a site, right?
Yeah, one of the most visited sites in all of Spain is the gorgeous royal compound of Muslim Granada, 13th century UNESCO World Heritage Site, the palaces and gardens of Alhambra. And it has been suggested that Alhambra originally may have been the fortress site where Shmuel HaNagid and his son Yosef, they were the Jewish viziers of the Granada Berber kingdom. The idea that first, before the construction of the palaces on the hilltop, roughly in the period of, let's say, 1238, that originally that was a Jewish neighborhood and compound is really fascinating. And again, it goes to the suggestion that, yeah, was the Golden Age of Spain always golden? But still, the Jews had a central role that they played in the development of these cities, of this society, of this culture, and the back and forth, the cross-cultivation, particularly between Jews and Muslims during that period, was so central.
Right. You know, we can't say with the Golden Age that might conjure up this idea that Muslim Spain was, you know, a modern democracy that valued multiculturalism and respect. We can't say that. But what we can say in the context of the medieval world, again, that this tolerated, right? I think the emphasis on the word tolerated, if you would agree with that, this tolerated Jewish minority, they were able to flourish in a way that wasn't possible under medieval Christianity.
100%, 100%. I mean, it takes us also to modern times, because if we go to where we started, the idea of the Golden Age or the glory days as a taste of nostalgia, or a search for nostalgia. It existed, it didn't exist, it existed to one extent or another. When the Jews of Europe began the long process in the 19th century of emancipation and enlightenment, the opening up to the non-Jewish world and the dream they would become equal citizens of the non-Jewish majority states that they lived in, they dreamed of a future where they would find tolerance and respect. As part of that search, they looked back to the Golden Age of Spain. They were looking for someone to say, hey, it's possible. We did it. You can do it too.
Wow. And we can do that today. We could be in our current situation today and look back at the Golden Age and find inspiration as well. You know, we can think about our current reality, you know, upheaval. We can look and say, are there signs in our time that when viewed from a future historical lens, as we're doing when we're looking back at the Golden Age in Spain, that might seem in the future like a golden age, or that we're on the cusp, right? That moment before there is a shift.
Yeah. Again, when we talk about sites and visiting places, there's no doubt that this search in the 19th and first part of the 20th century for a golden age and Spain and the story of Spain, the story of Iberia, was very inspirational. You go to Budapest, to the Dohan Synagogue. You go to the Spanish Synagogue in Prague. You go to New York Central Synagogue. Maybe there's people from Central Synagogue listening to us now. Cincinnati, Bnei Sharon, Isaac Weiss Synagogue. Denver, Temple Emmanuel. People who are traveling with us, their synagogues are built in styles, the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, Moorish revival. Because American Jews and European Jews hoped, hey, we could be like them. Revived. And that this idea of a dream of a new Jewish collaboration with the non-Jewish world, as you pointed out, a new creativity, new innovation, new security, like the dream of the days of Cordoba, Toledo, and Granada, that the glory days of Jewish Andalus may be far off chronologically, but maybe still has a chance for revival. And now, something for the road. A tip, a recommendation to help you make every journey your own.
Hi everyone, I'm Eran Shlomi. I'm an expert educator for J Squared, and this is my something for the road. A trip to Spain or to Morocco or to Portugal, anywhere, should be a trip when we're using all our senses, when we activate our mind, our body, and our soul. And I think music touches the soul more than anything else. It sets the mood, but it's also a very powerful educational tool. In Spain, for example, I'll have to play the kings of Spanish guitar, Joaquin Rodrigo and Francisco Tárrega, for example, when we drive in Andalusia from Seville or Granada to Cordoba, and that beautiful, melancholic and bittersweet music gets you in this Spanish mood, this Andalusian mood, but it also teaches us about Spanish culture, the heroes of Spanish culture and Spanish history. The most powerful use of music in Spain, I think, is Jewish music based on medieval Sephardic Hebrew poetry. For example, in Toledo, I played the music of Eti Ankari, an Israeli singer, songwriter, and musician of Sephardic background. She recorded a whole album using the poems of maybe the greatest medieval Sephardic Hebrew poet, Yehuda Halevi. He was born in Toledo in the middle of the 11th century and wrote many of his poems right there. Imagine how it feels to cross the famous bridge in Toledo above the Tajo River, leading to the city and the ancient Jewish quarter, while you listen in your devices the same Hebrew words written by Yehuda Halevi right there. One of his most famous poems that many of us Israelis learned in elementary school is called "My Heart is in the East, Libi Bamizrach." Here are some of his words. My heart is in the East and I'm in the uttermost West. How can I find savor in food? How should it be sweet to me? How should I render my vows and my bonds, while yet Zion lieth beneath the fetter of Edom, and I in Arab chains? A like thing it would be, it seemed to me, to leave all the good things of Spain, seeing how precious in my eyes to behold the dust of the desolate sanctuary. We can really understand Yehuda Halevi's world between the Christian world and the Muslim world. He is in the West, the outermost West, which was Spain, and his heart is elsewhere, in the East, in Jerusalem. Many of us Israelis learned this poem in elementary school, as I said, and he is regarded as maybe a proto-Zionist poet. And no wonder that the staircase that leads to the Western Wall in Jerusalem, they're called Yehuda Halevi Ascent. He eventually, toward the end of his life, made Aliyah, moved to the land of Israel, and is buried there. And I think there's another way to think of this poem, maybe as a bridge between the golden age of Spain and the golden age of the United States, of Jews in America. Maybe there's a question here we can think of living in two different worlds. Your heart is one place and you are in another place. Something to think about. Thank you for listening, and I hope I see you in Spain.
Thanks for listening. Dive deeper into the world of travel on our J Squared Adventures website. That's j2adventures.com. And stay in the loop with our latest adventures on all our social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, all under J2 Adventures. And if you enjoyed hanging out with us, don't forget to leave us a comment, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Until next time, travel safely and keep wondering. I'm Sorrel.
I'm Scott.
See you soon with the Wandering Jews.